He looked at the woman standing in line at the rental office and saw a problem. He saw the natural hair. He saw the accent. He saw a woman who, in his professional opinion, didn't belong in Birchwood Estates. What property manager Dale Fentworth didn't see was the Colonel's insignia she'd worn for 15 years. He didn't see the Arctic deployment patches, the commendations from 2 chiefs of defense staff, or the fact that he was about to pick a fight with one of the most quietly formidable people in the Canadian Armed Forces. Dale Fentworth thought he was protecting his investment. He was about to find out what it costs to mistake dignity for weakness. Birchwood Estates sat on the western edge of Oakfield, Ontario. One of those newer subdivisions built to look like it had history it didn't actually have. Brick facades, manicured hedges, a pond with a fountain that stopped working in October and nobody ever fixed until May. The kind of place where people paid a premium to feel like they'd arrived somewhere. The rental units were the 12 townhouses tucked behind the main complex, a concession made to zoning bylaws that management had never quite forgiven the city for requiring. They were identical to the owned units in every way except one: the people in them could be removed. Colonel Adaora Nwachukwu had driven 11 hours from CFB Petawawa the day she signed the lease, with 2 green military duffel bags in the trunk and a sleeping bag she'd used in temperatures that would close every school in Oakfield. She was 51 years old. She had commanded a logistic battalion. She had spent 4 months in Mali attached to a UN stabilization mission, coordinating supply lines across 300 kilometers of deteriorating road in 40-degree heat. She had on one occasion negotiated the temporary release of a fuel convoy from an armed checkpoint using nothing but a satellite phone, 3 words of Bambara, and a composure that her commanding officer later described in writing as almost unsettling in its steadiness. She was in Oakfield because her youngest daughter, Keturah, was doing her residency at Oakfield Regional. Adaora had retired from full active duty 8 weeks prior, was waiting on a consulting contract with the Department of National Defense, and wanted to be close to family for the first time in a long time. The unit at Birchwood was clean, the commute to Keturah's hospital was 12 minutes, and the lease was straightforward. She had signed it over the phone with the building's previous property manager, a woman named Sandra, who had been nothing but efficient and warm. Sandra had left the position 2 weeks before Adaora arrived. Dale Fentworth had been promoted internally from the Condo Association's Maintenance Oversight Committee, a fact that had given him a title, a ring of keys, and an opinion of himself that was roughly 9 sizes too large. Adaora first met Fentworth on a Tuesday morning in late November. She was carrying a banker's box of books from her car to the unit, wearing her old Petawawa base hoodie and a pair of worn canvas pants. The temperature was -7. She had her earbuds in and was listening to a podcast about medieval West African trade routes, which was exactly the kind of Tuesday morning she'd been looking forward to for years. Fentworth appeared at the entrance to the parking area, with his clipboard and his identification lanyard and a look on his face that she recognized immediately. She had seen it before, in certain officers' messes, in certain briefing rooms, from certain men who processed the information of her in the room, and arrived, very quickly, at the wrong conclusion. "Can I help you?" he said, not helpfully. Adaora took out one earbud. "Unit 4, just moving a few things in." "Unit 4 is occupied." "Yes," she said. "By me, I signed the lease with Sandra Ellison in October." Fentworth consulted his clipboard with the theatrical seriousness of a man who had recently been given a clipboard. "I don't have you on here." "I have a copy of the signed lease in the car if that's useful." Management changed in November. All tenancies were subject to review. Adaora set the banker's box down on the hood of her car. She looked at him with the calm, level attention of a woman who had once sat for 4 hours across a table from a general who wanted her to falsify a logistics report and had not blinked once. "What does subject to review mean exactly?" "It means I need to verify everything before you start bringing belongings inside." "I have a key," she said. "It was couriered to me." "Keys were issued before my review was complete." She studied him for a moment. "Are you telling me my lease isn't valid?" "I'm telling you I need to verify it." "Then verify it," she said pleasantly. "I'll wait." What followed was 45 minutes of Fentworth making phone calls inside the management office while Adaora sat on her banker's box in -7 weather. And finished the podcast. She wasn't performing patience. She simply had it in the way that people do when they have waited out things considerably worse than a property manager with a clipboard. When he finally came out, his expression had not improved. "I'm going to need additional references," he said. "I provided 3 references to Sandra in October. I'll need current ones, employment verification, financial statements." She tilted her head slightly. My application was approved, the lease was signed, 2 months' deposit was paid. You are asking for additional documentation that was not a condition of my tenancy. Policy has changed. Since October. Since I took over management. Right. She stood up and picked up the banker's box. I'm going to bring this inside now. If you'd like to discuss the lease further, I'm available this afternoon after 2. Fentworth stepped into her path. Not aggressively, not physically, but deliberately. A blocking gesture. This space is my gesture, ma'am. I'm asking you not to enter that unit until this is resolved. Something shifted in the air. Not because Adaora changed. She didn't. Her expression didn't harden. Her voice didn't rise. She simply looked at him with a particular quality of attention that a few dozen people over the years had described after the fact as the moment they understood they had miscalculated. Dale, she said, reading his lanyard. I am a lawful tenant. I have a signed lease, a paid deposit, and a key to that unit. Unless you have a court order, you have no legal authority to prevent me from entering. I am asking you professionally to step aside. I could call the police, he said. Please do, she said, and walked around him. She heard him on the phone as she went inside. Her key worked perfectly. It took him 4 days to escalate. Fentworth filed what he called a formal tenancy irregularity notice with the Birchwood Estates Condo Association, citing unverified occupancy and failure to comply with updated intake procedures. He sent a copy to Adaora's unit. He sent a copy to the association's board. He also, and this was where he made the kind of mistake that only a certain kind of person makes, sent a letter to the Department of National Defense Contracting Office, the address he found on one of the documents in Adaora's application, informing them that one of their consultants was involved in a housing dispute that may reflect on the professional conduct of the individual in question. He wrote that last part because he wanted to cause damage somewhere that mattered. He wanted her to feel it. He had no idea what he'd just done. Adaora read the letter to the D&D contracting office on a Thursday evening, sitting at her kitchen table with a cup of tea. She read it twice, then she called her daughter. Keturah, she said, do you still have the number for Miriam? Miriam O.C. Darko was a civilian lawyer who had spent 15 years doing human rights work before pivoting to housing and employment discrimination cases in Ontario. She was also Keturah's former law school study partner, Adaora's occasional chess opponent over video call, and the kind of lawyer who, when presented with Dale Fentworth's letter to the DND, said simply, "Oh, Dale, 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 Dale." Miriam's first call was to the Birchwood Estates Condo Association board. She introduced herself, outlined the situation, and informed the board that they had a property manager who had interfered with the occupancy of a lawful tenant without legal basis, attempted to block a signed tenancy through fabricated procedural requirements, and sent a defamatory third-party communication to a federal contracting office. She gave them 72 hours to respond. The board president, a retired accountant named Harold Voss, who had been in the position for 9 years and had absolutely no desire to spend his retirement managing a human rights complaint, called Fentworth within the hour. The call did not go well for Fentworth. She's just a renter, he said, several times in different configurations as if repetition would help. She is a tenant with a valid lease and a lawyer who just used the phrase Ontario Human Rights Code Section 2 in a sentence, Harold told him. Do you know what that means for this board? Fentworth said he was sure it would be fine. It was not fine. The association hired their own legal counsel, who reviewed the situation in approximately one afternoon and sent Harold a memo that Harold then forwarded to Fentworth in full, without comment. The memo used the words discriminatory conduct, bad faith interference with tenancy, and potential personal liability in the first 2 paragraphs. It recommended that the association distance itself from Fentworth's actions immediately. Fentworth called the association's lawyer himself, a move that the lawyer later described to colleagues as the most useful thing Fentworth did, because in that phone call, Fentworth said, on a recorded line, as all calls to the firm were, "I don't understand why everyone is treating this woman like she's special. She didn't show me anything." The lawyer ended the call and added that quote to the file. The hearing before the Human Rights Tribunal was 4 months away when things began to move, but things were already moving in ways Fentworth couldn't see. Because Miriam O.C. Darko was thorough, and thorough lawyers do not stop at the event itself. They look at the pattern. She filed a records request with Birchwood Estates for all tenancy files from the previous 18 months. Fentworth had been property manager for 11 of those months. The records showed that in 11 months, he had initiated tenancy review procedures for 6 prospective or incoming residents. All 6 were visible minorities. He had approved, without additional documentation, 14 applications during the same period. All 14 were white. Harold Voss received this information on a Wednesday afternoon. He took it home, sat with it overnight, and called Miriam on Thursday morning. "What do we need to do," he said, "to make this right?" "You can start," Miriam said, "by making sure Dale Fentworth no longer has access to tenant files." Fentworth was suspended without pay pending investigation on a Thursday. By Friday, 3 members of the association board had resigned rather than be associated with the liability. The condo association's management company, Arbor Property Services, issued a public statement that described the situation as an isolated incident inconsistent with our values, a statement that Miriam's office responded to publicly with a copy of the 6 tenancy files. It stopped being an isolated incident very quickly. The coverage began with a regional news site in Oakfield that ran the story on a Saturday. By Sunday, it had been picked up by 2 national outlets. By Monday, a journalist from a major Toronto paper had called Miriam's office requesting a comment. By Tuesday, a housing advocacy organization in Ottawa had issued a statement citing the Birchwood case as emblematic of the systemic barriers facing Black Canadians in the private rental market. Fentworth, meanwhile, was at home. He had not expected any of this. He had expected the union to cover him, except the association's property managers weren't unionized. He had expected the board to back him up, except the board had lawyers and self-preservation. He had expected Miriam to maybe send a stern letter and go away, except Miriam Darko had never sent a stern letter and gone away in her entire career. He did what people do in these situations. He went online, found the coverage, and read the comments. He should not have read the comments. His sister called. His mother called. An old colleague from a previous job texted to ask if it was him in the story and, when he confirmed it was, did not text again. His landlord, he himself rented an apartment in Oakfield, sent him a polite but notable email citing the morality clause in his lease agreement and asking him to call at his earliest convenience. On the 43rd day after Adaora had walked past him and into Unit 4, Fentworth received 2 things in the mail. The first was the formal notice of the Human Rights Tribunal application. The second was a letter from the D&D contracting office, addressed to him, informing him that his correspondence regarding Colonel Nwachukwu had been reviewed and found to constitute an unfounded and potentially defamatory communication, that it had been placed in the record with no negative consequence to the colonel, and that further contact of this nature would be referred to legal counsel. Colonel Nwachukwu, he stared at the rank. He had not known. He had not asked. He had looked at a woman carrying a box of books in an old hoodie and made a decision about who she was and what she deserved, and he had been so certain of that decision that it hadn't occurred to him to question it for a single moment. The Human Rights Tribunal proceedings began on a grey morning in March. Adaora attended in person, in civilian clothing, a charcoal blazer, pressed trousers, boots. She looked exactly like what she was, a composed, experienced professional who had been mildly inconvenienced by someone who had since made that inconvenience very expensive. She sat beside Miriam and did not look at Fentworth across the room, not because she was avoiding him, but because she had decided he was no longer particularly interesting. Fentworth was represented by a private lawyer he was paying out of pocket. The lawyer was competent but working with limited material. The proceedings were not dramatic, they didn't need to be. The record spoke, the 6 files, the 14 approvals, the letter to D&D, the recorded phone call. "I don't understand why everyone is treating this woman like she's special. She didn't show me anything." Miriam played that recording once. She didn't comment on it, she let it sit in the room. The tribunal adjudicator found in Adaora's favour on all counts. Fentworth was ordered to pay $22,000 in general damages and an additional $11,000 in special damages covering legal costs, disruption, and the documented emotional and professional impact of the D&D letter. The Birchwood Estates Condo Association settled separately for a figure that was not disclosed but that Harold Voss described, when asked by the Oakfield regional reporter, as significant. Arbor Property Services terminated their contract with Birchwood Estates 2 weeks after the settlement. They also quietly terminated Fentworth from their contractor roster and issued updated anti-discrimination training requirements for all affiliated property managers. A policy change that had, in its dry regulatory language, the fingerprints of someone who had consulted with a human rights lawyer before writing it. Fentworth did not return to property management. He found part-time work in inventory at a building supply company in a town 40 minutes from Oakfield. He was, by all accounts, quiet and unremarkable there. The clipboard was gone. Adaora used a portion of the damages award to co-fund a legal aid pilot program in Oakfield, operating out of the public library on Tuesday evenings, offering free housing rights consultations for renters who couldn't afford representation. Miriam volunteered the first 3 months of sessions herself. On the first Tuesday the program ran, 7 people showed up. 3 of them had stories that rhymed with Adoara's. The intake form asked one question at the top before name or contact information. What happened? It turned out people had a lot to say. On an evening in April, Adaora sat across from Keturah at a restaurant 2 blocks from the hospital. Keturah had 12-hour shifts 3 days a week, and the permanent expression of someone who had learned to sleep in 45-minute intervals. She ordered the same thing she always ordered, and then looked at her mother for a long moment. "Are you glad you stayed?" she asked. "In Oakfield, I mean, after all of it." Adaora considered the question seriously, the way she considered all questions. "I didn't stay because of the case," she said. "I stayed because of you. The case just turned out to be useful." "To other people." "That's what useful means," Adaora said. Outside, the street was wet with early spring rain. The fountain at Birchwood Estates was probably still broken. The hedges hadn't been touched yet. But in the public library on the other side of town, there was a schedule on the wall for Tuesday evenings, and people were writing their names on a list. And somewhere in the slow, unglamorous machinery of accountability, a few more things were being made slightly more right. Dale Fentworth had wanted Adaora Nwachukwu to feel small. He had reached for every instrument of petty power available to him and used them all. And she had stood in -7 weather on a parking lot and waited him out with the patience of a woman who had spent a career outlasting things far bigger than him. He hadn't taken anything from her. He hadn't slowed her down for more than a morning. What he had done was hand her, and through her a few dozen strangers in a library, something that couldn't be unfiled, unsettled, or undone. Some people look at someone and see a target. Every now and then they find out, slowly, expensively, and on the public record, that what they were actually looking at was a door. And that doors, when you push them wrong, leads somewhere you didn't intend to go. If this story stayed with you, like it and share it with someone who needs to hear that quiet strength is still strength. Subscribe to Sounds of Justice. There are more stories where this one came from, and every one of them is true in the ways that matter most. What stays with me about Adaora's story isn't the tribunal ruling, or the damages, or the fact that Fentworth ended up counting inventory bolts in a town 40 minutes from the life he'd wrecked. What stays with me is the image of her sitting on a banker's box in -7 weather, earbuds in, waiting. Not performing calm, actually calm. That's a different thing entirely, and most of us only learn to tell the difference by watching someone who has it for real. I think about the choices she made in that parking lot. She could have raised her voice. She could have listed her credentials the moment he blocked her path. She had every right to. Instead, she asked him one clear question, gave him one clear answer, and walked around him when he refused to move. That's not passivity. That's something harder, the decision to let your actions speak at the speed the situation actually requires, not at the speed your anger is demanding. There's a kind of integrity that doesn't need an audience. Adaora had spent a career building it, in logistics depots and UN field camps and briefing rooms where people were sometimes hoping she'd slip. She didn't slip. Not there, and not in that parking lot. When Fentworth later said on a recorded line that he didn't understand why everyone was treating her like she was special, that quote tells you everything about his confusion. He thought respect was something you allocated based on what you could see. She had spent 30 years understanding that it's something you extend regardless. That's the part that matters beyond the legal outcome. The outcome was satisfying, sure. The 6 files, the 14 approvals, the pattern laid bare, that was the work of intelligence applied carefully and without shortcuts. Miriam didn't win that case on emotion. She won it by being more thorough than the other side expected anyone to be. That kind of disciplined thinking, gathering what's real, building what holds, is the thing Fentworth never had and couldn't account for. But what I keep coming back to is the perseverance underneath all of it. Adaora didn't have to fight this. She could have found another unit, swallowed the indignity, moved on. Many people do, and not because they lack courage, because fighting costs something. And not everyone has the reserves. She had reserves. 4 decades of showing up, of doing the hard thing in hard conditions, of not quitting when quitting would have been understandable. You don't build that overnight. You build it the way she built her career. One unglamorous decision at a time in parking lots and field camps and briefing rooms, long before anyone is watching. Fentworth mistook that history for nothing, and that mistake, that specific failure of character, of perception, of basic human decency, is exactly what handed her the tools to build something useful out of what he tried to do to her. The Tuesday evening program at the Oakfield Library didn't come from nowhere. It came from someone who understood that strength isn't something you hoard, it's something you pass through.